Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We have a lot of guests here today, which is always a good thing. We're happy that you're here. I am filling in for Greg this week. He's out of town. Unfortunately, I don't have any football jokes this week, so you have to go without. But I do have some compelling thoughts that I'm excited to share and looking forward to doing that. I have given a sermon before. It was several years ago. There were about 8 people there. One of them was Elizabeth, and one of them was my grandmother. And I think that went pretty well, but there's no recording, so you have to take my word for it. But I am excited to speak to you today. We're going to be talking about didn't get any instructions on this. Have I turned there we go. We're going to be talking about the power of generosity today. And these thoughts are really inspired from this group and my experience in this group. Kahabahites has been a very generous group to me personally, and I think just in general. So today is not an indictment or a you can do better type of thing. It's really a celebration of a strength of this group, but also a reminder of something that is really important. Just to give a personal anecdote to sell my point of view, this isn't really my thing, but I'll give you a personal anecdote. In 2020, Elizabeth and I sent an email to the group, and we said that we were in a foster parenting class, and we needed some baby stuff because we didn't have any baby stuff, and we specifically asked for used and unwanted and extra baby stuff. We said, please don't buy us anything, only things that you aren't going to use anymore in the first place. And it was a really overwhelming response. We received so many gifts. And a lot of brand new gifts that people went out of their way to purchase, and all of this accumulated with a baby shower that had invitations and decorations and the whole thing that many people were involved in organizing. And it was an incredible experience, something I'll never forget. So that's my point of view this morning, and excited to share these thoughts. We're going to specifically be looking at the roles of the giver and receiver in generosity, and how both roles are important, and how both roles have specific responsibilities, and how Christians should be ready and willing to be both a giver and receiver, really at all times. Our first point is going to be the power of financially supporting Christians. And so we'll turn to our first passage in Acts chapter 9. And we'll look at the story of Dorcas to start our thoughts this morning. Acts chapter 9, starting in verse 36. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was not near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, please come see us without delay. So Peter rose and went with him, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, rise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up, and he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. We don't know a lot about this person, Dorcas, but one thing we do know is that she was very generous. And she was very generous to widows, which is an extremely vulnerable group in this time. It's really hard, I think, for us to overstate how vulnerable a group of widows would be in the first century. And Dorcas was very busy making garments for them. And some of the original words in this passage indicate that she was overflowing with good works and that charity was her identity. This is just what she was known for. It's also interesting that we get her Greek and Aramaic name, and this seems to indicate that a lot of people in both groups or both languages knew her very well, and she served whoever. Didn't matter what your background was, didn't matter what your language was. If you needed help, Dorcas was going to help you. She was going to do what she could. and she was going to serve and be financially generous to these other believers in the first century. I think it's an interesting question to consider if Dorcas ever expected to be repaid for all of these gifts that she was given. And I think it's pretty obvious there's absolutely no way. She was helping people who were just trying to survive. Widows in this day would often die of malnourishment or starvation. And so Dorcas is being generous. She's being financially generous to people who cannot pay her back because this is important to her, and it's important for her to serve this group. So in our first takeaway here, as we look at Dorcas, we see that simple acts and acts of giving make a big difference in the lives of others. You know, a sweater is a fairly common item. It's not particularly special, but when it's given in love to someone who really does need that, it makes a big difference. And filling financial needs is something the receiver does not forget. We see here when Dorcas passes away, her community is devastated. It's a huge loss for them in a lot of ways. Not only does she provide needs that people have every day, she is just a rock for a lot of people and a really good friend. Let's look at our second example of the power of financial support of other Christians. Let's look at Acts 2. And let's start in verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And when all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So in Acts 2, the church is extremely new. It's brand new. We don't know if we are maybe in like the first couple of days of the church here in these verses, or maybe a few weeks or months afterwards. But the church is just getting started. It's brand new. And we see this intense financial support of each other immediately displayed. In this context, there's a lot of pilgrims in Jerusalem who have traveled for Pentecost. They're staying longer than they expected to because of their conversion to Christianity. They're running out of money, which is not a good thing to be running out of in a place you don't live. We see that they are in each other's company often. They are physically close to each other in this new life that they are sharing. This phrase, all things in common, is really interesting because it kind of blurs the line between private ownership. It's almost as if no one really owns anything because everyone is being so generous to other believers that if anyone needs something more than me, it's theirs, without a second thought. It's really interesting because these believers in Acts chapter 2 probably don't know each other very well. They are from different parts of the Mediterranean area. A lot of them aren't going to speak the same language. And so it takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of trust to financially support someone who you might not really know very well. And so it's a really amazing demonstration of faith, both in the church as it exists in this time, but also in Christ himself. So our takeaway from the second example of financial support of other Christians is that this happened right away. This was something that started almost immediately in the early church and in a very intense sort of way. These believers in the first couple of chapters of Acts are trying to survive. They are certainly a minority. They are still learning a lot about Christianity. They need each other for survival and growth. And we see that their friendships and their bonds are growing so tightly as they continue to invest in each other and share with each other. This financial support of other Christians really helped relationships grow in the first century and is a really important concept for us today to notice the needs of other believers and notice what we can do to make a difference. Let's now talk about the power of helping people in need. So a little more generalized than our first point, but our first example will be Jesus and his ministry. I don't have a passage for this just because there are so many, but when we consider Jesus in his ministry, there are dozens and dozens of examples of him just being kind to others, sharing what he has, and showing kindness to people who are in need. Many times he would change someone's life just by giving them time or attention and material blessings and food when that was appropriate. And a large part of his ministry was simply just doing good for others. And I think this is really interesting and maybe isn't emphasized enough, because it's very clear in the Gospels that Christ does care about the physical well-being of others, and he really does care about the physical well-being of people who are in need. And when he would do this, when he would share and give people relief from some sort of physical need, it would draw them in, and it would give him a chance to share something even more important and address their spiritual needs. And this idea of helping someone who's in some sort of physical need that opens the door to address a spiritual need is very, very relevant today, and not something that we should overlook or pretend isn't relevant. Jesus would gain trust by treating their physical needs, which set up a chance for him to address their spiritual needs. And furthermore, when we help people, random people, people that we know, with some sort of physical need, some sort of financial need, we are sharing a blessing that we don't actually own, and is a way that we can point to Christ, which is exactly what Christ did in his ministry. Our second example of the power of helping people in need comes from the book of Ruth. So let's turn to Ruth. We're going to be starting in chapter 2. Starting in chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was one of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." This is a very beautiful passage, and we see that Boaz, depending on translation, is kind of explicitly identified as a very wealthy person. It may not be clear depending on your translation, but in the original language, it's really emphasized that he has a lot of wealth, he has a lot of fields, he has a lot of employees. And Boaz is as part of the Judaic law, required to leave the edges of his field unharvested for people just like Ruth, for people who are widows, for people who are kind of on the fringes of society. And there are, of course, loopholes that people would exploit to get out of this, but Boaz is not doing this at all. Boaz is actually making sure that there is enough for Ruth, that she doesn't have to go to another field. He wants her to stay, and he's happy that she is there. Boaz is really excited that Ruth is in his field, and he's really excited to make sure that she gets what she needs and that he can use his blessings to take care of her. And an interesting question to consider is, does Ruth deserve the kindness and care that Boaz gave? Ruth is not from this area. She is kind of trying to survive. She's from a different country, and she's with her mother-in-law, who's also trying to survive. She hasn't done anything for Boaz. She's really just kind of happened to come into his life. And so what's important for us to realize is that Boaz doesn't really he obviously knows a little bit about her because of what she's done for Naomi, but he doesn't really interview her and try to figure out if she deserves to be in his field or not. He is happy to share what he has to give her relief from her situation. And Ruth is really blown away by this. As you see in this last verse 13, she's really stunned because Ruth is used to being shoved to the side, ignored, and she's used to being really hungry. But Boaz makes sure that that isn't the case. So our second takeaway from this section is that sharing blessings with others gives them relief in the moment, and it creates a bond. And if you know the story of Ruth, you know how it ends. It's a wonderful story. Boaz and Ruth ultimately get married, and there's a lot of symbolism in this story that we don't have time to dig into today. And we will come back to the book of Ruth for another point in just a moment. Another example of the power of helping people in need comes from daily life expectations. Let's go to the New Testament, to Matthew chapter 25, and read maybe one of the most compelling passages that explain the power of helping people in need. We're going to start in verse 31. This is Jesus speaking, and he says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from the other, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty when you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer him, 'Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me.'" We are expected to do good for others when they need help. That is absolutely clear from this passage. And what's even greater is it's as if we are doing it to Christ himself. It's a very critical aspect of Christianity, and we can serve Christ when we give to others in need. I don't see how you could draw any other conclusion from this passage. But a question to consider is, when we give, or do we view giving to others in need as directly serving Christ? Or are those separate things for us? Clearly, when we do even the smallest charitable act for someone, when we give in any sort of way, it's as if we are doing it for Christ, which is an incredible motivation for a charitable heart and for a heart of giving. It's a very powerful act because, and we'll dig into this in a minute, but both the giver and receiver are benefiting from this. The giver, in this case, is going to receive a blessing from Christ, and then the receiver is receiving a real blessing in the moment that does make a real difference. We already concluded that Christ does care about the physical well-being of people, and this is another way of making that point. So our takeaway from this point is that when we share blessings with others, it is a way that we can directly honor Christ. Such a powerful way of giving. Let's now talk about the power of giving mental and emotional energy. This is, in my opinion, the hardest form of giving. I think maybe sometimes people think or assume that some sort of financial contribution is the most challenging, and I guess depending on the amount, it could be, or it could be impossible. But as far as the effort required and the energy required, I think giving mental and emotional energy is the hardest form of giving, but it's also the most powerful. So let's dig into this. The first example of giving mental and emotional energy comes from Jesus himself. And again, this is throughout the gospel. There's not necessarily one passage that makes this point because it's a theme throughout the gospel. There are many instances where Jesus would stay up all night praying and pouring mental energy into others. This is a very common pattern that he displayed in his ministry. And the cares and problems of other people weighed on him greatly. And he was thinking about others, and he would expend a lot of mental and emotional energy on the problems of other people. This took a lot of effort, and he would lose sleep. Maybe he was stressed. It's hard to know exactly what he was feeling given his dual nature, but this cost him a lot to do this, and is a wonderful example for us today for how we can do this for others. But if our life is maxed out with our own schedule and problems, are we really going to be able to give others emotional energy? If I have to be somewhere at 8 a.m., and so I have to leave at 7:40, so I have to get in the car at 7:35, so I have to wake up at 6:30, so if our life is like that, where if any small thing goes wrong, everything is a disaster, we're not going to have room to give mental and emotional energy to others because we can barely keep up with our own life. We'll talk about some ideas to address this in a minute, but it is important to leave time and leave energy available that can be given to others as they need it. Our takeaway from this point is that Jesus gave more thought to others than himself. Really, the whole premise of Christianity is this idea here. We'll look at another example of giving mental and emotional energy, and we'll go back to Ruth. This time in chapter 1. We already talked about Boaz's generosity to Ruth, but let's look at Ruth's generosity to Naomi. Then Naomi arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." It's important to note at this point that Naomi's husband has passed away, and Ruth and Orpah's husbands have passed away. So we have three widows who are dealing with a lot of grief and a lot of unknowns and are in a really vulnerable, desperate situation. Verse 9. "The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." They lifted up their voices and wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Verse 15. And and Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. And this passage is really interesting because Ruth is as impoverished as you could possibly be. But she is choosing to give the one thing that she can, which is mental and emotional energy. Ruth is in survival mode, as we've already discussed. She's going to struggle just to get enough to eat each day. And getting through a single day is very difficult. She's dealing with a lot of grief from the passing away of her family members, and so is Naomi. And so it is perhaps unwise for Ruth to stay with Naomi, and Naomi realizes this, and she says, we have to separate. This is not a good idea. But Ruth chooses to bear Naomi's grief and to be with her through the end. A question to consider is, can Ruth really afford to do this? Her life is on the brink. She has really no way to provide for herself. And so she maybe, in a sense, can't really afford to do this, but this is what she chooses to do. And it's also important to see that Naomi is a good receiver. She realizes that Ruth is serious and is willing to stay with her and doesn't argue anymore, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And so in this example, we see the power of giving mental and emotional energy for the giver and receiver because they have each other in this sense. They're staying with each other, and they're both able to bear each other's grief through this really difficult time. This is definitely the hardest form of giving mental and emotional energy for both people, because it takes a lot of vulnerability and it takes a lot of humility. But it has the most power and has longest lasting effects. And again, if you read the rest of the story of Ruth, it's really incredible how these relationships build. In the end, Naomi really does become Ruth's mother. So if there's so much power in giving for both the giver and receiver, why is it hard to give? Sometimes people will say, it's just difficult to be generous. It's, I can't afford it. It's complicated. It's messy or whatever. Why is it hard to give? Well, I personally don't think that giving is very difficult, but what is difficult is making a plan to give. I already alluded this morning to how when there literally isn't a spare minute in your day to adjust to something that comes up, you really can't react to that. You're not going to be able to respond. So giving is difficult when there isn't a plan. And so I also believe that people are very naturally and instinctively generous. If you look at any culture at any point in time, the people of that culture will definitely take care of the weakest members and definitely go the extra mile for people who need their help. This is universal, and it's part of being a person. We don't have to get stripped away from our humanity to be generous. This is a natural part of us. But we do have to set aside time to think about being generous and to make a plan. We need to make a plan for spontaneous needs as they arise out of nowhere and for anticipated needs. And I would just like to reiterate from what I said at the beginning that I believe this group is very good at this. This is a strength of this group. But it's also just really important to reflect on this and to remember how important this is as a believer. Being ready to give can take a lot of different forms. It can take the form of maybe having a gift card in your wallet for someone who spontaneously approaches you on the street. It could be a little more complicated, like some sort of special account that is for charity purposes only. Or it could just be putting a block on your calendar that says, in this period of time, I'm going to pour emotional energy into someone by really consciously reaching out to someone who I know might be dealing with something and really not taking no for an answer when I reach out. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. So our takeaway from why it's hard to give is we really just need a plan. We really just need something premeditated so that we can be ready to give. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. We need to be ready to give at all times. So why is it hard to receive? We've talked about the giver and receiver responsibility some. This might be kind of a weird question. Why would it be hard to receive something good? How hard could it be to accept a gift? Well, it has been my observation that in our Southern culture, the worst thing that you can do, and it's not even close, the worst thing you could possibly do is inconvenience someone else. And so our Southern culture is very polite, it's very deferential, it's very accommodating, which is very good. And I think people around the world kind of recognize this as a unique trait of the Deep South. But unfortunately, that fear of inconveniencing others gets extended to declining generosity when it is extended. And so, because no one can give if there isn't a receiver, and no one can receive if there isn't a giver, in this scenario, the receiver kind of shuts down a potential generous act. And it comes from a place of good faith, I think, and it comes from good intentions. But that's kind of the whole point of being generous. It is an inconvenient thing that someone is willing to do for someone else because of their love and care. And so, despite our reluctance to maybe inconvenience someone, when someone has offered something, we need to say yes. We need to allow others to be generous to us, and we need to allow others into our life and allow them to bless us in a way that they're willing and able to do. So when someone offers to buy your dinner, say yes. When someone wants to watch your kids spontaneously with just a few hours' notice, say yes. If you get invited to something, say yes. If someone is willing to bless you, which is very critical to Christianity, as we've already discussed, we need to let that happen. We need to say yes. We need to be a good receiver. If we reframe this idea in a more zoomed out context of Christianity, and we think about Jesus and ourselves, and think about how he has offered us something very generous. He's offered us salvation, and it's on the table. And there's really nothing that we can do to fix our own spiritual situation. All we have to do is say yes. And I think we are all in agreement that this is how that plays out. We have to accept what has already been offered. And if we don't accept that, that would be very self-destructive. So if we return back to this idea of why is it hard to receive maybe here on earth, and if we realize that good things come from Christ, why would we reject something that's already been offered? It's already on the table. We need to say yes more often. So our takeaway from this is that if we first remembered that our salvation is not of our own doing, and we are in desperate need for help, and we remember that we've already said yes to a generous gift, it will be much easier for us to say yes to a generous offer from someone that we know or from someone that we don't know. And what's more, our lives will be better. It is good to accept generous gifts. They do make our lives better. They make our relationships stronger, and it allows other people to serve, which is very important. So we have some closing thoughts as we consider all of our points that we've made today. I think our first takeaway should be that we are so blessed in so many ways, not because we are so great, but because someone else has been so generous to us. And if we start there, being a good giver and being a good receiver will be a lot more comfortable or a lot more natural if we start with what has already been done to us in a spiritual sense. Takeaway number 2 is that the body of Christ must support the other members. We talked about this with Dorcas and with the early church. These people were extremely busy and extremely dedicated to filling the financial needs of other Christians as they arose. They were excited to do this. They had specific plans on how to do it. And this is something that we should continue today. It's something that Cahaba Heights does very well. Our next takeaway is that we will always have the poor, but that's not a reason to ignore them, but it's a reason to show compassion. And Jesus demonstrated this countless times in his ministry, showing that he does care about the physical situation of others, and he would take action very often to address it. Takeaway 4, giving emotionally to others is very difficult. It is the most costly, it is the most energy demanding, because people have messy lives and they have problems that don't go away. Some things just can't be erased with a check, but sometimes those problems are the most important to address and the ones that will create the most meaning and have the most power when they are addressed. And investing emotional energy in others does create deep friendships, and it's exactly how Christ treats us. And so we should emulate him and do the same for other believers. And giving and receiving can be difficult, but if we have a plan on how to do it, it will be a lot easier. And if we maybe take a little bit more humility and are more ready to say yes to what has already been offered, then our relationships will be stronger, our lives will be better, people will have a chance to serve, and people will have a chance to be served. Both are very important for Christians. We didn't, if maybe you were kind of expecting to hear a couple of passages that I didn't get to today. We didn't discuss the widow's 2 pennies. We didn't even mention the Sermon on the Mount. And we didn't even mention the Good Samaritan, maybe the most famous passages about giving and being generous in the Bible. But that's because there is so much content about generosity in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's almost on every page. And so what I hope today has been encouraging, but I hope today has also sparked a deeper realization that being generous, being a good giver and a good receiver is essential for Christians. And it is really, really important to be good at both. Like I said, my inspiration today has been from this group and the many different acts of generosity that I've observed over the years. So I'm happy to be part of this group, and I hope all of these strings continue. But this is also just a good reminder to remember how important this is. It's our tradition to offer an invitation at the end of our service here. We haven't really talked about salvation per se. We've talked about a lot of things very closely related to it. We've talked about how we have the offer of salvation on the table, and all we have to do is say yes. So if you would like to do that today, or